3, 4, 8. What? You want me to keep going? 1, 2, 1, 2, 8, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Nope, you're fine. Thanks, guys. All right, and I'll just kill the stream. You want me to get on the logo?
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion over lunch of the question of China and clean energy and innovation. So we've got a terrific panel and a terrific opening speaker here. I'll just spend a moment on why ClearPath is interested in this topic and why we wanted to make sure to have this discussion here on the Hill. So first, again, welcome from Jay and myself and everybody at ClearPath. ClearPath Foundation is an organization focused on baseload clean energy. So we work on nuclear, clean fossil fuels, hydropower, grid-scale storage, and the things that would turn renewables into baseload. And we're very interested in the question of China and innovation and how the competitive threat of China could help or hurt our ambitions here in the United States. So folks used to say that the United States electricity system was the most sophisticated machine in the world, right? That we had both a generating fleet and a set of transmission lines that had never had anything else approaching it in terms of ambition and complexity. Unfortunately, that is no longer true. So starting in the 1990s, China began to build a fleet that is now nearly twice the size of the US fleet. An enormous amount of that fleet is coal. And for all of the talk that both China's renewables industry gets and even its nuclear industry gets, we rarely talk about the gigantic ambition and progress of the Chinese coal industry and the Chinese coal fleet. This is a fleet that's almost entirely ultra-supercritical coal plants. They were built in factories with unrivaled efficiency and speed. They brought their vast scale to bear in a way that no one in the world has ever done in the power sector. So what China did with its coal fleet is the biggest thing that has ever happened in energy. And so I think the question we have here before us is, will China repeat that feat in other areas? Will China repeat that feat in solar or in nuclear or in advanced fossil fuels? And is that a threat to US industries or a very interesting opportunity for all of us to sell our innovations into a vast new market? And so to kick off this conversation, I'm very happy to introduce Congressman Ryan Costello. Congressman Costello is a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He represents the 6th District of Pennsylvania, west of Philadelphia, which for energy nerds like me, all folks should note is the headquarters of PJM, the largest competitive RTO and ISO in the country. The congressman has been described as a pragmatic conservative. He's been involved with ClearPath in developing a plan for federal clean energy innovation, and we're very thankful for working with him on that and on his support and sponsorship for this event in this space today. And we thank him for launching off this discussion on clean energy innovation.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I was asked to share a few words with you centered on the question of whether or not China is winning the clean energy innovation race. And as that question is asked, the answer from my perspective is yes. They are winning the clean energy innovation race. If we were to distill it a little bit further, I would say they are certainly at least winning the clean energy deployment race. And I'll speak about that momentarily. But I want to particularly thank our panelists and our moderator, Amy Harder, for their joining the conversation here today. Amy's recent Axios article does an excellent job of highlighting policy trends that show the how and why as to the reasons for how China has gotten out in front of the United States in the innovation race and, as I mentioned, the deployment race. And I thought it would be important for members, staff, and the public to learn more on this topic. Clean energy innovation is a policy area that I have gravitated toward as I learn more about the subject, now in my role as a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and certainly, I might add, with the unfortunate decision, or what appears to be the unfortunate decision, to withdraw from the Paris Accord. I do believe that that will require a policy response from elected representatives to chart an alternative course or to reaffirm what the emission reductions should be in the next 15, 20 years and beyond in our country, and how we can go about remaining a global leader on that topic. When it comes to creating and deploying clean energy resources and technology, though, just the data itself suggests that China is cleaning our clock at the moment. $300 billion in 2016 alone was China's investment in clean energy sources. We're losing an incredible opportunity to be the global leader. This will deliver more domestic jobs. It will bring us closer to American energy independence. It also has, over time, a real tangible impact on public health outcomes. I think it is the right thing to do. If you look at where the jobs are being created, it is in the clean energy space. It is not in it's not in coal. It's not. That's not where that's not where you're going to see economic growth in our country. It is nuclear energy. It's solar. It's carbon capture technology. It is battery storage. They will reshape the global energy sector, and it's really just a question of whether or not we are going to formulate and shape policy to direct those jobs in such a way that it becomes a smart investment to do it here in the United States of America. No one is better at developing the next generation of cleaner, more affordable, and more reliable energy technology than the American entrepreneur. And we need to do more to leverage our strengths and to take advantage of this opportunity. The final point that I would make is this. Why, right? Why is China beating us at this game right now? And I think the answer is really simple. And this is what I hope that the forum will add some meat to today. And it's something that as policymakers we need to do. And it's the fact that we do not have a long-term coordinated energy and environment strategy. And if you don't have a coordinated long-term strategy, capital will decide to locate itself somewhere else. If we are going to lead, it has to be because we have a policy that provides certainty so that decisions are made in such a manner that people feel comfortable investing here. And this goes from our educational system to private capital to how we innovate within a regulatory framework that people can trust. So with that, let me thank you for the leadership that so many of you provide on this important subject, from ClearPath to many other trade associations and think tanks, journalists, and other policymakers. We do need to change course. We need to alter course, I should say, or redirect in such a manner that people are going to look to the United States to be the global leader that we should be. I look forward to learning more during this conversation, and I would like to turn things over to today's moderator, Amy Harder, to get things started. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Congressman, for your remarks and for your leadership on these issues. So one piece of housekeeping before we go in. Folks will see on your seats we have note cards. And so we're going to have a little time for open questions at the end. But I think the primary way we'll do this is if folks have questions or comments that they'd like to be integrated in, if you could just take a moment to jot those down on your note card, and we'll be sort of actively collecting those and feeding those up to Amy during the conversation. Before I introduce the panel, I want to take one more piece of introductory prerogative and follow up on a point that the Congressman made when he asks, why is it that China is able to take the lead and has this broad strategic vision? I think one area where China thinks very differently than us is this basic versus applied research distinction is not something that they see or worry about. In fact, I think they're very happy to take our basic research and put in the applied research and development and commercialization. So in some sense, we can think of a basic only research strategy in the United States as welfare for the Chinese economy to help them take and grow and commercialize and then sell back to us, which I think they've now successfully done with a number of technologies. So with that tone and biasing all the witnesses here, I'll go ahead and introduce the members of the panel. First, we're very lucky to have Amy Harder as our distinguished moderator. She's been an energy reporter at Axios. Did I pronounce that correctly? Not Axios, Axios, since April, and formerly held that role for 3 years at the Wall Street Journal, also several years at National Journal before. As the Congressman noted, she's published, I think, at least 2 pieces now on this issue of China's role in clean energy innovation and its competitive posture towards the United States, one of which was certainly the inspiration for this event. So, Amy, we're very thankful for your coverage and thoughtful analysis there. Lastly, Amy is from Washington State and received a BA in journalism with honors from Western Washington University. I'm just going to go ahead and also introduce the distinguished members of our panel. First, we have Varun Sivaram. He's the Philip D. Reed Fellow for Science and Technology at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the author of the upcoming MIT Press book, Taming the Sun, Innovations to Harness Solar Energy and Power the Planet. He teaches at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, is a fellow at Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy, and serves on Stanford University's Energy and Environment Boards. He's pretty much wrapped them all up there. He's advised both the mayors of Los Angeles and the governor of New York on energy policy, and was a former consultant at my alma mater as well, McKinsey & Company. Don't hold that against either of us. He holds a PhD in condensed matter physics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Next, we have Christopher Guith from the Chamber. He's been a senior vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Energy Institute for the past 9 years. He was previously a deputy assistant secretary at the Department of Energy under President George W. Bush, as well as legislative director and counsel for 2 former House members. He has a law degree from Syracuse and a BA in business economics from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Next we have, I have the order right, yes, next we have Shannon Angielski. She's the executive director at the Carbon Utilization Research Council, where our sister organization, ClearPath Action, is delighted to be a steering committee member, and is a principal at Van Ness Feldman, where she has served at a variety of senior roles since 2001. She has a master's in environmental science and public policy from Johns Hopkins and degrees in political science, Spanish, and international affairs from the University of New Hampshire. Last, we have David Blee. He serves as the executive officer of the U.S. Nuclear Infrastructure Council, where I believe we're also delighted to be members in our sister organization. He was reappointed in 2016 by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to the Civilian Nuclear Trade Advisory Committee for a 3rd term and serves as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Advocacy. He was previously a U.S. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy, Director of Public Affairs for the Energy Department, and a Congressional Chief of Staff. His private sector experience includes assignments as EVP for NAC International, where he directed U.S. and international business development, as well as NAC Worldwide Consulting. He's a former SVP for Robinson Lake, Lair, and Montgomery, a Wall Street headquarters strategic communications firm. So thank you very much, and Amy, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Rich, for that great introduction. I want to thank everybody here in the room and also those joining us online to be part of this discussion. Just as a follow-up, as Rich said, we'll be taking some questions written on the note cards that are on your seat. And also toward the end, we'll be throwing it out for some live questions in the audience. So please be thinking about things you'd like to write down and ask or to stand up and ask. Well, I want to jump right into kind of already what has been a common thing that the Congressman and Rich have talked about, and that is really what is making China win this clean energy race. The Congressman said that it was because the U.S. doesn't have a comprehensive energy plan. Do you agree with that? And if not, what would you say is, of course there's many reasons, right? But what would you say is the overriding reason why China has pulled away in this space? Varun?
Thanks, Amy, and thank you so much for having me here. I think the Congressman nailed it. China does have a strategy, and the United States doesn't. Let me unpack that a little bit. I think that China has a strategy that plays to its core competency. The United States not only doesn't have a strategy, it also is not playing to its core competency. The United States' core competency is innovation. Unfortunately, our strategy, which is hazy and murky, doesn't play to this competency because we don't seem to want to increase our funding of research, development, and demonstration for energy innovation. That puts us at a disadvantage because that forces us then to compete on China's terms. Now, China is playing to their core competency by manufacturing products at great scale using technology that largely has been developed outside of their borders. They're very good at this, and there are various reasons why their economy is structurally equipped to do this very well. In the United States, so long as it uses only the tools of trade policy to try and wrest back market gains from China, is going to be playing a losing game or fighting an uphill battle. So I think the answer here, just as the Congressman mentioned, is the United States needs to have an innovation-focused grand strategy where we support research, development, and demonstration of new technologies that others cannot manufacture as fast as we can develop them. And second, we certainly do need to pursue rational trade policies, perhaps not to the extent that this administration has pursued them, but rational ones that protect U.S. industries that do, in fact, generate innovative new advances from, for example, having to relinquish their IP over to China. I want to keep my answer brief, but one of the things I'd love to talk about later on is how I think China's getting better and better at winning the clean energy race in new products. I think they developed a playbook in the solar industry. They have conquered that market, and now they're conquering the electric vehicle market with even greater pace based on the playbook they developed for solar. So I'd love to talk about that.
I do. I just happen to have a question on that topic, so we will get back to it. Christopher, do you agree with the congressman? And if not, what would you say is the driving reason?
Yeah, I agree in part. I would take a little bit of a further step back and say that this is, you can't have this conversation solely and talk about clean energy because you're talking about all trade. And their playbook covers everything. And it's no secret that China has not been bashful about employing unfair trade practices. And Varun certainly referenced one, but whether it be alleged dumping, whether it be currency, whether it be forced IP transfer, it is all part of the strategy. And it's important to look at the entire give and take as it relates to trade, not just the small snippet that is clean energy. While it represents a tremendous growth opportunity globally, it's only one part of the overall global trade, and they are employing these strategies across the board. And then the other part I would say is that it's sort of apples and oranges because China is a centrally planned government. I mean, they can come out with Made in China 2025 and stick to that strategy. We are not a centrally planned government. We pride ourselves on free markets and on capital expenditure, and our goal is and should be to create a process whereby the private sector, as well as academia and the government writ large, can find ways to capitalize on the resources we have. And so we're never going to be able to do the same things that centrally planned governments are, and frankly, that gives us the dynamic that enables us to really do well here. Having said all of that, I do think that we are leaving a lot on the table because of the lack of investment in basic as well as applied R&D, which we'll certainly get into later.
Great. Shannon?
I'm going to just pivot away from China for one moment and maybe contrast that with how I see a lot of our energy strategy here, at least playing out at the policy level here in the U.S., which is we tend to have much more siloed energy sector policies that are implemented here in the U.S. on the basis of politics maybe, and largely driven over the last decade by climate change policy. So as opposed to maybe having one core comprehensive strategy, as maybe the Chinese can do, we see a lot of competing policies that don't necessarily intersect or work together and make it very difficult, even in a free market environment, to actually have a real free market. So that, I think, is part of the challenge and stifles some of that innovation that I think we want to have here in the U.S. But it also breeds a lot of infighting among all of us in the energy industry to fight for what, in terms of where we see the need for innovation. We're fighting for small pieces of a very smaller pie that gets smaller and smaller every day, I would say. So I think that we need to think about that differently here in the U.S. if we want to be able to have a thriving not only energy sector, but if we want to have that innovation from the U.S. and be able to use that innovation globally. I think that we have to think about how those competing policies are hurting us, not necessarily helping us.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I think, are we talking about an energy policy or a climate and energy policy? I think those are two very different things. David, can you talk about, perhaps from the nuclear angle, and what you think China is doing that the U.S. is not?
Well, first let me say I think the congressman did a great tee up there, and I agree. China is winning in the deployment space, certainly in the nuclear energy. They have 20 reactors under construction, which will bring them to 56, 57 reactors. We're at 100. In terms of, but in the other area, in the area of whether they're winning the race, I would say it's not game over, it's game on. So really what we do in the next 10 years, but I think we really need to look no further than TerraPower, which is something you wrote about, Amy. And they gave two reasons. TerraPower is a traveling advanced reactor. There's two reasons, advanced wave reactor, sorry. Two reasons they gave for going to China. One is there's energy demand. That's something we're lacking here, 1% growth a year. And they also have a long-term policy translated to a master plan for nuclear energy. They didn't mention the fact that they also have regulatory surety. You can, in China, you have a legal requirement to get things licensed in 2 years. The NuScale reactors going into the NRC here took about 6 years to prepare the license application, and it'll take at least 4 years to get it through the NRC. So that's double the fun. In terms of what they also did mention is everywhere China is providing sites. So when you say they have energy demand, they are also providing a site. So Bill Gates was in China this past week, and Premier Lee said that advanced nuclear is a great area to cooperate, and I agree. It's a triple-edged sword, though. They're a customer, they're a co-developer, they're also a competitor.
Right. To Christopher's point, I think he made a great one about how it's comparing apples to oranges. We are a democratic government. Of course, here in a Capitol building, we would be remiss to talk about the gridlock that is facing Congress on a lot of these issues. So given that you inherently cannot compare an apple to an orange, how is it perhaps okay that China is dominating in these spaces? And if yes, then how can the U.S. make sure to capitalize on what it cannot do compared to China? If China is going to have unfair trade practices and dump billions and billions of dollars into these technologies in a way that the U.S. would never do, even under the Obama administration, when the rhetoric was there to support clean energy, you still did not see the money, again, because of Congress. So can you guys talk to perhaps this idea that, okay, well, if we can't dominate the way China plays the game, is there a way that we can win a different type of game in this space?
I'll start. Yeah, I think your point is exactly right. We cannot play at China's game, which means we can't use their playbook. We can't provide our manufacturers a ton of, indefinite loan guarantees. We cannot set these extremely high deployment targets and create an enormous national market. But there are targeted things that public policy can do to create, first, the push incentives to get innovation off the ground, and then to kind of unleash our market forces of innovation to then develop technologies, and finally, to implement rational trade policies to protect our industries as best we can. So that's kind of three-pronged approach. The first prong is there are certainly investments that the United States can make that the private sector is not making to a socially optimal level. The United States spends on the order of $6 billion a year on research, development, and demonstration of new technologies. By 2021, China will surpass us on that front. So not only will they be winning the deployment race, they'll also be winning the innovation race, whereas the United States appears to either be holding its budget constant or proposing to reduce it, depending on what happens at the end of this year. We absolutely need to increase that budget. So the first step is do what we can on supporting innovation. The second step is allowing innovation to flourish. It's not good enough just to provide research dollars. In addition, you've got to make sure that there are some niche or beachhead markets for nascent clean energy technologies to get some scale. And I think we can do that, for example, through targeted government procurement. We're not going to be able to do it through massive national deployment the way China can. But in addition to procurement, we can do it through demonstration support, helping to demonstrate the first-of-a-kind product, be it a carbon capture demonstration, advanced nuclear plant, your first-of-a-kind next-generation battery, in a way that de-risks it for the private sector. And that final point, that third thing that we can do, again, this is our playbook, not China's playbook, is we do need to protect our firms from the worst excesses of policies, for example, by China that might take advantage of U.S. firms and make them transfer IP. We should not allow that to happen. But it's not the case that we should use trade policy as a very blunt tool, for example, to impose sweeping tariffs on all solar panels, as we are considering doing right now. So I think there are like three things that the United States can do. These three things are manageable. Even with our political system in gridlock, we aren't a centrally planned economy, so we can't do what China's doing. But I think that's the point. We need to play to our competency. It's innovation. We don't need to do as much as they're doing on setting up an enormous national market.
Christopher, what advice would you give to President Trump?
Working for a very, very large tent organization, again, I'll take a step back first and then dive in. I mean, making the U.S. more competitive is always at the center of all of these issues. Firms are fleeing the U.S. not just because the regulatory system is moribund and other places are less so. It's also because we don't have a very competitive tax structure. And so while this is not a tax discussion, that has as much, if not more, to do with decisions that are made in the private sector over the next 20 years than anything that's done as relates to actual DOE investment. Now, diving into that specific part of energy and clean energy, there's different components to this. And I mean, we're talking about first and foremost innovation. And as long as China maintains a forced tech transfer, we're still going to have the edge on innovation because they're taking today's version while we're working on tomorrow's. And in order to capitalize on that, that moves into a sort of manufacturing component. Are we able to manufacture here versus manufacture somewhere else? And this is true across the entire business sector, not just within energy, but certainly other competitive countries around the world have made domestic manufacturing a paramount concern, and China is certainly one of them. And eventually we will get into this discussion, but I will sort of tease it to say that China's strategy about dominating the global export market is much different than China's strategy on how it gets and provides its own energy.
Shannon, can you speak a little bit to what you think the U.S. could do in the space that you work on for cleaner coal technology?
Sure. So as an organization that's really focused on coal technology development needs, I can't talk about that really without talking about, again, the sort of the market here in the U.S., which you mentioned. I think one of the panelists mentioned that we're seeing a load growth here in the U.S. or energy needs either remaining flat or constant or declining in some regions of the country. And then really cheap natural gas as a competitor to coal. So a lot of that's driving coal technology development as well as the challenge of climate change. And whether or not there is a policy that is implemented at the federal level, even though we are seeing the Clean Power Plan being repealed by this administration, at least my members and those in the power generation industry would say that we need to live in a future where we are going to have to address emissions of CO2 from our coal fleet as well as our entire fossil fuel fleet. So if you start with that premise and you think about coal and what the Chinese are doing with coal here in the U.S., it's really not economic to build a new coal plant in this country. And then from a long-term investment perspective, to have a 30, 40-year asset, knowing that you might have a policy come down on you or you might need to do something with that coal unit to reduce its emissions profile, it's really not economic, and that policy certainty isn't there. So here in the U.S., our focus on technology development has been on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And I do think that we have a real opportunity as opposed to, say, the Chinese on that front, because we have also an abundance of oil here in this country that cannot be recovered without that CO2 that is needed to pull it out of the ground. And that CO2 then stays in the ground. So you're in essence producing what could be construed a low carbon barrel of oil. But we have a real opportunity here in the U.S. to get that economic value from that CO2 in a very broad and large scale that the Chinese don't have because of their geology and their ability to access oil. So that's certainly something that from an innovation perspective, if we want to look at it that way, we are definitely going to have a lot of fossil fuel that we could export and dominate that part of the global market. But then we could also, of course, innovate on the CO2 capture side and be a global leader and export that technology as well.
Isn't most of the CCS, carbon capture and storage technology, most of the innovation and deployment in terms of pilot projects happening in China compared to, say, the U.S.?
Not on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. It's happening globally, and the U.S. has several projects, the Canadians, the Europeans, Australians, but less. China had a project called GreenGen that is now sitting idle, is my understanding. And they don't have that market opportunity necessarily to use their CO2 in an economic way like we have here. They are evaluating technology, and they're looking at innovation in the CO2 capture space. But I think that we have more of the infrastructure here in the U.S. to actually catalyze an industry and implement the technology in a way that the Chinese may not, because they don't have that mature enhanced oil recovery industry like we have here in the U.S.
Great. David, can you speak to what you think the administration could do on the nuclear front to sort of counter what China is doing?
Well, I think they're doing a lot of things right now, and one is...
They being the administration, the Trump administration?
Yeah, the president came to the Department of Energy on June the 29th and announced a 6-point energy plan, and most of the people in the nuclear energy community fainted when it was the first thing out of his mouth was, we're going to reinvigorate and expand nuclear energy. So there is an ongoing White House review. They're not doing a Blue Ribbon Commission. They're not doing a report. They're basically doing a series of presidential memorandums in various areas to look at how to accelerate advanced reactors, how to certainly to work on exports, how to reform a regulation, how to, in terms of the supply chain, other areas like that. So, and also Secretary Perry's FERC initiative, 403, where they're looking to level the playing field with respect to nuclear and coal, and also to provide, monetize reliability, resiliency, and fuel security. So that's, they are doing some things there. They've also asked for money for Yucca Mountain. It's a key infrastructure issue. I think the way that it isn't, but the way we win isn't really by trying to mirror the Chinese policy. It's really out-innovating their policy, because we have one key weapon in that ours is based largely on the private sector. So if we could provide a government approach that leverages our private sector, particularly on advanced reactors, we can win that race. The government does have to streamline regulation. They need to provide the seed money. We're spending more money right now on nonproliferation. $2 billion on nonproliferation efforts, $1 billion on advanced, really on nuclear energy. Much of that goes to the National Laboratory. And we need to have a really smart policy that leverages the private sector, reforms regulation, and does provide incentivization for first movers. That is absolutely imperative.
Varun, did you want to respond to something he said about the FERC initiative?
Yeah, I mean, this is a little off topic, but...
I'm here to foster disagreements wherever possible.
But I'll try and be a provocateur. So I'm entirely with you. It's terrific that the administration supports the advancement of nuclear energy. Let's just stop there. The FERC notice of proposed rulemaking that came from the Department of Energy is a terrible way to do it. There are very good reasons that we should support a nuclear energy industry in this country. Nuclear energy is zero carbon. The industry in the United States is not doing very well, and yet it is important for national security reasons that we have a thriving nuclear industry at home. And one day the nuclear industry could provide serious economic gains if, for example, the United States is first out of the gate on advanced nuclear technology. There are terrific reasons to support the nuclear industry. But the proposed rule that Secretary Perry wants FERC to pass would use this odd resilience argument. The argument that because nuclear reactors and coal power plants can store fuel on site for 90 days, which is a relatively arbitrary requirement, they should be given certain subsidy payments. It's received bipartisan condemnation. I'm not going to relitigate all the things that are wrong with it, but you can read the comments that have come in. This is a terrible policy measure in order to achieve a very laudable goal. I don't think that's the way we should be planning policy.
I think this debate is an example of something that China doesn't have to deal with, right? If China wants to do this, it would, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we focus on the bigger picture. I do want to move. I have a series of lightning round questions, which means that I ask the panelists to keep their answers to one word only, if possible. So, we've talked a lot about this playbook that China has really is perfecting in terms of making cheap products, right? Everything, so many things that we here in America have is, quote, made in China. And whether that's our clothes or solar panels. So with that, do do you guys think it's a net positive for the world that China has perfected this playbook, or a net negative?
I only get one word. I mean, that's two words, net negative.
You get two. You get net positive or net negative.
I'd love to expand, but I'll say net negative.
Christopher?
Yeah, negative.
Shannon?
You know what, I'm not sure I have an answer. I'd probably go with the negative, actually.
Okay, David?
I'm not agreeing that they perfected the playbook.
Yeah.
Well, they perfected theirs.
They perfected a playbook that has provided us with lots of cheap things. So on that note, of course, as Varun has already alluded to, there's this trade case pending to the Trump administration to U.S.-based but foreign-owned solar manufacturers are asking the administration to impose tariffs on a flood of cheap imports, any type of imports, though they're largely aimed at China or Chinese-owned companies throughout Asia. I think we got what Varun's position was, which is that he's opposed to it. So I suppose you can just repeat that answer. But for the others, I want to hear about where you come down on this. Do you think Trump should issue tariffs, or do you think tariffs or some type of trade remedy, or do you think he should reject what the ITC, the International Trade Commission, has recommended? Varun?
Reject.
Christopher?
We don't have a position.
Shannon?
I don't have a position on the solar either.
And David?
Yeah, tariffs aren't our first concern right now when it comes to the regulation. It's really, we need to look at what we can do to propel U.S. nuclear here. That will become more of a consideration later on.
And since you're only holding us to one answer, I gave you my one answer, and now the follow-on is that while the commercial users across the world are benefiting from a new abundance of clean energy technologies being deployed by China, and sometimes below cost, sometimes arguably illegally, I would say that innovation has taken a big hit because it's not necessarily in China's best interest to innovate beyond what the market wants right now. And so while they're pushing out certain indigenous innovation companies around the world, that means innovation starts to get stifled.
Let's go back to what Christopher said a couple of times about how this isn't just a clean energy race. This is an energy race, and that China is exporting all of these clean energy technologies, but really just doubling down on coal. Though, the International Energy Agency has said recently that China's deployment of solar has skyrocketed. So if each of you could speak to this idea that it seems like China, largely because of its air pollution problems, not because of climate change, but because of the terrible air quality that it has in its largest cities, how that's compelling it to, in addition to continuing to double down on fossil fuels, it's also starting to actually deploy some of these clean energy technologies. Maybe if Varun wants to start. Oh, just basically, do you see that China is expanding into this area, and do you think that's going to change the race? Do you think it's going to start taking over both the innovation and deployment technology fight?
I'm still not sure I quite understand. The fact that they're expanding into fossil fuels?
No. The fact that they've doubled down on fossil fuels, but now they're also starting to deploy in their own country different types of solar technologies and
Absolutely.
wind.
So I find that in the case of developing the solar playbook, domestic deployment was the second step in this two-step process. First, what they did was they supported their domestic manufacturers of solar cells and panels, and those domestic manufacturers sold those products abroad, taking advantage of very generous incentives in countries like Germany. Then those incentives dried up, and China realized, it is a very good idea to keep our manufacturers in business by incentivizing domestic deployment. It's also a good idea to incentivize domestic deployment because we have these air pollution concerns. So that's how they figured out the playbook, this two-step process, in the solar case. In the battery case, they've smushed them together. Both domestic manufacturer support, from 2010 to 2015, BYD got a ton of support, as well as domestic deployment support have happened simultaneously. And we're seeing, BYD is a Chinese battery and electric vehicle manufacturer.
Just to make sure everybody is on the same page.
So now we're seeing them accelerate this playbook. So now there's both production and deployment support in China. I think they will continue to use this revised, smushed playbook going forward. They're going to use the might of their domestic market as well as the might of their China state balance sheet to support their producers. The net effect is for products to be manufactured and used within China and then exported around the world. So I think they've figured out that playbook. I do want to echo what you just said a moment ago. It's such an important point. This would be good for the world if all we needed were today's clean energy products. This would be wonderful. China has gone and subsidized the development and the manufacture of, the best silicon solar panels and the best lithium-ion batteries. And they continue to incrementally improve those products. But there is very little innovation into the next technology generation, the generation after today's solar panels or after today's batteries. That's going to power, for example, the 500-mile range car. And that's why I believe that China's current position of leadership in the race is a net negative for the world. Because they are, in fact, stifling innovation into the next generation of technologies. That's not a good thing.
Christopher, do you concede that just in addition to it doubling down on its coal assets, that it's also beginning to deploy some renewables?
Sure. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. The amount of solar that they've installed last year was significant. I think it was like 33 gigawatts. But you have to take into context their entire electricity economy. I mean, even while it's expanded, and when you're starting with zero, it's easy to have exponential growth. But even while you saw massive growth in solar last year, wind came down, and more importantly, coal was still the #1 new build. And while the part that kind of bugs me about this conversation is people like to talk about China cleaning our clock, and to some extent that's true as far as the global trade is concerned. But while they're building for the rest of the world, they're not necessarily using it themselves. I mean, especially if you look at the dispatch rate. I mean, if you look right now, wind and solar account for about 15% of China's generation capacity, but it's only dispatched at about 5%. Part of that is obviously because it's intermittent, but it's also because it's just not as reliable and it's not as cost effective when you're trying to build or maintain the economic juggernaut that is the Chinese economy that is still not only increasing its industrialization, but going beyond that. And a lot of people talk about or project that, well, especially as we talked about the Paris goals, that, by 2030, things are really going to change. Well, I mean, the numbers just don't prove that out. I mean, more than anything, I think it's about their demand for power. And they can afford, because it's a centrally planned government, to throw money at all kinds of different technologies, because at the end of the day, they're going to find a way to use it because their demand keeps increasing. But I guess the one thing I'll leave it with is right now they're getting about 3% of their electricity from gas, 4% from wind, 1% from solar. I'll take a bet from anyone in this room that you come back 2 years from now, gas is going to be larger than any of those. I mean, gas is a growing potential there. They have the largest shale reserves in the world, and they have just barely begun to utilize it or tap it. And while the rest of the world switches to a more commoditized gas economy, China's not going to miss that boat either for deploying or exporting technologies, but also utilizing it domestically.
Shannon, do you?
Sure. You mentioned, Amy, that their air pollution issue is certainly one of the challenges that they have in looking at clean energy. But what they're also doing is replacing older, less efficient coal plants that are right in their city centers, and they're shutting those down, repurposing that property, and then they're building new highly efficient coal plants outside of the city and building transmission lines, and then they're fully scrubbing them. And so they are doing the same thing that we did back in the 70s here in the U.S. with our coal fleet. But they're also planning to build, well, one of the numbers that I see that you have here is they have their current coal fleet is about 950 gigawatts. And here in the U.S., just by comparison perspective, we have 250 that used to be around 350, and that was when we had about 50% of our electricity generation coming from coal. So as we see our coal fleet going down, theirs is going up. And I think their last 5-year plan for coal was to build and level off their coal fleet at about 12 to 1,300 gigawatts by 2030, I believe. And their plan to actually reduce the emissions intensity from that fleet is to develop highly efficient materials. They're looking at coal plants that can operate at 50% efficiencies, which is about, on average, what our natural gas fleet here is doing here in the U.S. So So they're already innovating in this space, and they're doing it in a way that they, whether or not they live within the Paris Accord or not in the 2030 timeframe, that gets them to 2030. Beyond that, we'll see what they do. And then one last point, at least on the shale piece of it, I mean, there was a delegation that was just here that spent a month here in the U.S. going around the country, and while they were here to talk about coal, they want to know how to build natural gas combined cycle plants. So that is the new technology that they're going to take home and adopt and try to produce their own shale in the way that you just described. So in any event, I can't speak to the other clean energy aspects, but that's what they're doing with their coal fleet.
I want to take a question here on the note card, and then we'll also throw it out to the audience if you have any questions that you would like to ask the panelists. A great question, maybe we can start with David on this. In the nuclear space, it's much more than just energy policy and trade. There's non-proliferation concerns and security concerns. Do you think the U.S. is losing its leadership in this area? And if so, what will the new leadership look like, and who's going to lead that if it's not the U.S.?
Well, we're on the precipice. I mean, we haven't lost yet, but clearly you look out at the reactor orders right now. 70, the Russians are winning right now in terms of just backlog. It's going to be a very competitive market. In the past, the U.S. dominated the market. We're looking at the South Koreans, Chinese. We're also looking at the French and clearly the Russians. So if you can get a 25 to 30% market share, you're actually doing pretty well. So it's a different paradigm from the past. What that means for U.S. nonproliferation is, well, when it comes to, we can't just simply stipulate in 1, 2, 3 agreements, the civil nuclear trade agreements, that they can't enrich, they can't reprocess. These should be commercial agreements. But the way it does, if the nonproliferation policy was based simply on promulgating through agreements, you're losing. But the best way for nonproliferation to be strengthened is to have American companies out in the global market with their safety cultures, with their nonproliferation cultures, actually building reactors and running reactors. We have the finest reactors in the world here. We have the safest reactors in the world. And so to the extent that Americans won't be running everything, yes, you could say that nonproliferation potentially, but same time, there's no indication that China and Korea and others are not going to work within the IAEA, which is a very, very fundamentally important agency here.
What about concerns of uranium supplies?
Well, we've been reading about that recently, I guess.
Yes, we have. That's a different country dealing with Russia, but I mean, that's of course at the core of these issues.
We import 90% of our uranium. So.
And where does it mostly come from?
I don't think there's proliferation risk on Kazakhstan mainly, but I don't think there's proliferation risk on uranium. I really don't see that being a proliferation risk.
Christopher, do you have any comments about the non-proliferation side of nuclear energy?
Yeah, our non-proliferation policy is one of the more asinine policies this government across multiple administrations has ever had. Sticking our heads in the sand and claiming that if we keep our technology from the global market, things are going to get better from a proliferation standpoint. Completely oblivious to Russian deployment, to Korean deployment, to French deployment, and we're not necessarily saying that they're bad actors, but Lord knows they don't have to follow the same rules that the Department of Energy and NNSA put on our domestic manufacturers. And so we're denying our economy that ability, but more importantly, we're denying the world the gold star when it comes to non-proliferation. And it's damaged proliferation globally, and it's damaged our manufacturing capability when it comes to nuclear exports. And I would dare say that, you said precipice. I would say that if we don't change this quickly, we have lost that onus or that driving force that has made us the dominant nuclear power commercially, globally. And it's time to pull our head out of the sand. And maybe because there is so much Russian deployment coming, we can see, hey, we're not the only operators anymore. In fact, we're starting to become, unfortunately, a much smaller fish. And if you see what's happening globally, maybe it's time. Maybe it will enable the federal government, specifically the executive branch, to realize that we need to change tack really quickly. Otherwise, proliferation is going to get worse, and we're going to be left on the sidelines without the ability to export.
Yeah, that asinine, that was the word I was looking for. But I think that if we're not building reactors here at home and we're not exporting reactors technology in the supply chain, yeah, it's asinine.
I should try to fit asinine into my next headline. I do want to throw it out to the audience if we have any questions. Don't be shy. I have lots more questions on here that I can ask, but please raise your hand if you have any questions as we keep chatting here. One thing we've talked a lot about is this metaphor of this being a marathon. So another lightning round question. Let's say the New York Marathon happened yesterday, so it's certainly on my mind. How many miles ahead is China in this clean energy race?
Can I give more than one word, please?
It can be a couple of words, yes.
I reject the metaphor because...
Okay, great. Also, that can be your alternative answer, but you have to tell another metaphor.
Oh, no. I mean, I reject the metaphor because we don't know where the finish line is. So if the finish line is generally like today's kinds of technologies, solar panels kind of look like what they do today as they do in mid-century, the batteries kind of look like what they do, China is like 13 miles ahead. They've passed the halfway mark. We're not getting those markets back from China. We are never going to be manufacturers of today's commodity products. But if the finish line, let me tell you, I plug for Taming the Sun, if the finish line is solar panels that look like coatings that you can unroll into carpets or put on your windows, if the batteries enable 500-mile EVs, if nuclear reactors are meltdown proof and can literally fit in small modular form inside an urban transit hub, then the finish line is much farther away, and China is maybe a mile ahead, but we're only on mile 2. And we have a long way to go before we develop the technologies of the future, and the United States has plenty of time to win that race.
Christopher, do you have a mile number to give me, or?
It depends which race. I mean, on the innovation side, we're still ahead. And I'm not sure that there ever is a finish line. But
Better be in good shape then.
Well, as far as the future, and I would also say that it's not just innovating the technology, it's ensuring that it's adoptable worldwide, meaning that it's economically competitive. So, as things become more efficient and materials become cheaper, you could have the greatest technology in the world, but if it's too expensive for developed and developing economies alike to adopt, it doesn't really matter.
In the coal space, I think we're definitely ahead.
Yeah, I can only think in kilometers, but I would say
you can provide your answer in kilometers. That's allowed.
But I would say Yogi Berra said it's not over till it's over. I think the real battle is in the advanced nuclear space, and in our view, whoever wins that is going to win because it is a game changer in terms of the economics, the licensing paradigm in terms of design basis, financing should shrink their advantage there. It can revitalize the supply chain because you now can build 100% of the reactors as opposed to 65% of them in the U.S. And it's a natural product for export. So, game on.
Great. Well, for my final question, I want to look far ahead and look at some of the technologies that perhaps we may not have quite talked about yet. We've talked about solar and electric cars a little bit, of course, nuclear power and clean coal technologies. What's an area that maybe is just getting off the ground where maybe the U.S. still has a chance to really dominate? And if each of you could just briefly talk about kind of what you're looking at in this space, about something that maybe is not on the radar of people in this room.
Totally. Two things. First, technology that converts sunlight into fuels. Can be hydrogen fuels, can be carbon-based fuels. This technology is colloquially known as artificial leaf technology. There are prototypes that do this at 10% efficiency, 10 times more efficient than plants do it themselves, but we can do even better. We need to scale that up. The second, I think there's lots of scope for the United States, and by the way, the United States is the world leader on artificial leaf technology. There's lots of scope for the United States to win on digital technologies. These are technologies that are a little easier to bring from early stage development to deployment, whether it's a smarter way to run the electricity grid or autonomous vehicles.
Because it's not cheap manufacturing.
Exactly. It can take tremendous amounts of capital and time to get a new material, chemical, or process off the ground. These digital technologies are where the United States can really shine.
We sort of hit on it, but I still think it's where the biggest fight is right now, and that's storage. I mean, everyone looks at storage as a necessary for renewable deployment, but storage is universally needed across all generation types, whether it's nuclear, whether it's coal, and it makes markets more efficient, it makes markets cheaper, and we're still using technology that's 60 or 70 years old. So I think that's an area where everyone is still fighting. And the one area that I would say that is especially Asian-centric right now is gas hydrates. I don't know that we necessarily have a big need for it here, given all the gas we have. But if you look at the work that's been done in both Japan and China, as far as being able to mine and produce gas hydrates, I mean, that's something that, I mean, you want to talk about tipping the world on its head. I mean, if you can essentially displace all gas producers, whether it be Russia or the Middle East, that is the biggest game changer you can ever possibly imagine.
One technology area is to find ways to convert CO2 into other useful byproducts. So there's a lot of work and innovation that's taking place in that space right now here in the U.S. and I think globally. One market opportunity, for example, is to convert that CO2 to use in cement for buildings or roads or things like that. I certainly think that there are bigger market opportunities. I think one of the things that we need to do is start talking about carbon dioxide as a commodity. It might drive investment there in a very meaningful way, both globally, but I think here in the U.S., I think if people know that there's an opportunity to benefit from carbon dioxide instead of calling it a pollutant, then maybe it'll be a little more appealing from an investment perspective. But I certainly think that that's an opportunity.
Well, I would totally agree. Well, we don't agree on the FERC rule. We do agree on digitalization and the additive manufacturing as two areas. But I would say let's not forget R&D and infrastructure. We have to remain the go-to country for whatever space we're in. And in the area of nuclear energy, we have it was called the Advanced Test Reactor, still advanced, but we have an advanced test reactor at Idaho that's 60 years old. Right now in the advanced nuclear space, some of the companies are having to go to Russia, other places for their experimentation for materials. Materials is a very key thing for advanced nuclear. So we really need to have a commitment to building an innovative advanced test reactor here in the U.S. to make sure we continue to be the leader in R&D. That's very critical.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panelists and the audience and hand things back to Rich for some concluding remarks.
Great. Well, thanks very much to all of you for a very interesting discussion. My two major takeaways are, one, we're not going to beat China at their own game, but we could be playing a different and smarter game, and we would benefit from not massive top-down mandates and control, but a much smarter, more comprehensive strategy through all parts of the innovation pipeline, but using our way of doing this. And last, I just love that interchange between Christopher and Amy on this being a never-ending race and therefore us needing to stay in really good shape, right? If we don't keep a really strong innovation architecture and pipeline and network in play, we'll fall ever further behind in this. So Amy, Varun, Christopher, Shannon, David, thank you all so much for your comments, and I hope everybody will join me in a round of applause for our guests.